Now that we've done our blending, let's gouache. All right, so we have done our staining and it's now time for us to add some gouache to our painting. This is where it gets pretty interesting. So our picture looks awesome all by itself. If you want that effect, it does look good by itself like that. I hope yours look as lovely as mine. So now it's time to do the real deal. It's the washing time. So I'm using my dry cakes. This is my dry cake palette. It is gouache is opaque, but you can water it down by adding water to it or mixing it with white to make a light thinner or a different shade. And you can have it work as a regular watercolor effect, but it normally is thicker and more transparent. For gouache, you can also add watercolor to it, but it has a different texture to it. So I'm using my round brush for this project. So we used our brush pen, fine tip brush pen for first blending portion, and now I'm using my round brush. This round brush came with the kit here, so I love it and I enjoy using it. It's perfect for my gouache project. So I'm activating the pigment on all of my cake here. So I just dip with the tip of the brush on the green, the yellow, the orange, and just do an activation like you're waking the palette up, because it will get dry after a while and it stores really nice. So depending on the gouache you're using, I'm using dry gouache. Hopefully you are using the same. Anyways, you can still try the jelly or any other gouache that you're using just to see if you get the same effect. But if you're using dry gouache, which for me acts much more like a watercolor type of agent or medium, as opposed to the jelly, acts a little bit different. It's a bit more thicker, so you may have to water it down or to get a better wash or get the same colors or tones as myself, what I'm getting here. But no worries, it's the same gouache, kinda. Just using the same technique will give you almost the same results. It's just a matter of knowing how to mix them. So we've learned the blending and staining technique in the first half of the video. Now we're actually going to be gouaching. So I've mixed a deep blue, as you can see the colors that I've mixed, and I've added a little bit of black to it. I think just purple, sorry, just to get the area nice and blue. I'm adding my first wash. So what I'm doing is just getting my basic color down, because I'm trying to create the water. So with a smooth stroke as well, you want to cover the area. So this technique that I'm doing first is wet on dry. So the paint is wet, but the paper is dry. That's why they call it wet on dry. I've also taped my paint picture down to my craft mat. Normally what you want to do is cover the edges with washi tape or just tape. I like this tape because it doesn't damage the paper. Washi tape is nice, but some washi tapes I do find they lift before you are able to complete your project, and the water sometimes seep underneath. But go ahead, you can use washi tape as well. So I just do this for demonstration purposes, and I just tape down, rip a little bit off and tape down the edges. You can remove the tape when you're finished and then cover it with whatever color you choose, but I'm gonna leave mine for the moment because we are working on a project and I want to show you what taping it down looks like, as well as what the effect will be. So you could either put the tape underneath the project and have it lay flat, or put it around the border like you would do a washi tape. but for the example I just taped the tips of the edges. Right, so I'm laying down my basic blue. So I mixed the strong purple with a dark green and blue just to achieve that purple shade. So sometimes when you're mixing your colors, you might think, okay, to get a darker shade, you will mix it with black, just because black, or a deep brown, because those are darker tones. But no, you can add deep tones, like you can add red to your mix, deep purple, some black, some green, anything to get it nice and deep, because it also gives it a nice tone, like an undertone to it that you might not pick up with the natural eye right away. Just like we all know, light is not just white. There's a lot of mixture of colors in the shade of light that makes it transparent white. I know that's a weird example, but it is true. So adding my almost lavender purple wash. Also remember that gouache dries very light, so sometimes for the lighter colors they dry a bit stronger, like your yellow may be a bit vibrant more than your black. Black does dry very light, so don't be afraid to add black to your paper or black. So when I'm mixing and I want a nice deep color for my darker black shade, I will add my rich blue or purple to it, so it gives it a nice strong black look. So see how my by painting the area around the fish and the twig here, it gives almost like a lifting, like my fish is not so much lying on the paper but actually in something. So it gives it a dimensional look to the actual subject, and that's what we're trying to achieve with our gouache here. So we're going to be patient and let it dry. I air drying this today. You can use your blow dryer or your heat gun. Be very careful when you're using your heat gun, because sometimes the surface, the nozzle is probably small and it doesn't cover all the area at one time, so you have to move it around. So be careful when you're using your heat gun not to just focus on one area, because you will scorch your paper, but be gentle and go around in a circular motion or up and down wherever you got puddles. Don't let it rest right at the puddle, because it will dry in a staining effect and give you a hard line, and you don't want that. Blending gouache is not always easy when you have a staining, unless that is the effect you're looking for. With watercolor you can get away with it because that's how it works, the regular watercolor palette. But when you're gouaching, you want to have as minimal harsh lines as possible if you don't want to. A lot of people said that when they're gouaching, it's easy to paint over, but it depends on the type of gouache you are using. So I'm using the dry cakes, which acts like a watercolor, so that I want to bear in mind that it will leave harsh lines if I don't blend it quite well out. Alright, so what I've added, you realize that I have two-tone for my water. One reason is make sure that you mix enough in your first batch to cover your whole subject area, or make sure you know the colors that you have mixed and what proportion, because you will get a different shading. Luckily this is just my base layer, so it does not matter, although it gives it a greater effect of diversity because I'm adding two tones to it. So when you're adding your second layer, it will give it that much varied kind of texture to your actual background, and that's what I like. So don't be afraid to add colors to your picture. Gouache is lovely to work with. I like how it dries. It dries matted. So the big difference with gouache and watercolor is that gouache is thicker in terms of it covers the area in a much more denser way rather than watercolor, which does cover it, but you might have to add your mix thicker all the time. While with gouache, if you just do so you dip the brush into the water and make a quick wash of it on your cake and add it straight to the object or the picture, it covers it a lot more, meaning it just gives it that nice darker, deeper coverage. As opposed to the watercolor, you have to probably mix it and mix it and mix it really good and then apply it to get a nice thick rich coat. Watercolor spreads. If you add lots of water to it, it will run, it will spread, but you can control it by mixing it thicker or being very steady and gentle with your strokes or your application. While with gouache, it doesn't take much for it to be mixed. It's already thick and it dries matted, so it doesn't dry with any rising. With a watercolor technique, you will find when it's dry, if you run your hand over the picture, you will find textures to it. So you'll find a little bit of rise in here if you add thicker watercolor paste to an area. You'll find that there's a bump, rather like a lift, a rise in. So no matter with gouache how thick you layer it, you won't find a bump or grooves, or it will just lay flat when it dries. With that said, I don't know if you pile on the gouache if it will have any smooth rising or bumps, but from my experience, I never find it, no matter how many times I've layered it, that it had any bumps or any grooves. It just laid flat. All right, so remember to add extra coverage to your area if you want it darker. Okay, so now that I've covered my area and I'm doing my second layer, using a round brush to mix the colors, I've added my purple and my my darker shade mixture to the blue and mix it. You want to mix it well to achieve that nice deep purple shade. So I kind of have a looking like a royal blue shade, but it will dry a bit lighter. As I mentioned, when your darker colors dry, they dry a bit lighter, so you want to not anticipate that it's going to dry dark, but apply it first and then let it dry so you can actually see the true shade. So remember that gouache dries lighter all the time. Have that in your memory. The more you dilute it, even if it looks really dark and thick, especially your black, it does dry lighter. So using the round brush as I'm doing, you want to apply the paint in gentle, steady strokes. Be careful when you're going around your objects. You can remember to use the tip of the brush as opposed to the body or the belly of the brush. I'll show you that in another video. Just use the tip of the brush to get around tight areas. You can change your brush, but at this point we are using one brush just to make the project a bit easier and just flowing smoothly without changing our brushes. So we're using one brush. So we're using the round brush. So be careful just to make sure that your strokes are steady. You don't want any jagged edges unless that is the effect you're actually looking for. So need steady stroke, especially around the body of the fish, the body of the object when you're nearing it. Gentle, steady stroke. It will, with gouache, it will work with you if you are slow and steady. Not overall slow and lazy steady, but slow and delicate steady. Okay, so for your first layer of water, you mix dark purple wash. That's what I mixed, the dark purple wash, and I covered the area. Make sure you mix enough so it covers your whole entire surface area that you wanted to color. instead of having it portion by portion, unless that is what you're looking for. And your second layer, which I'm now applying, mix a deep dark shade of purple with a dark blue and some black in it. Try to make a deep, rich, dark royal blue tone. So I'm trying to get the water nice and dark and thick. And the aim is to make the water look rich with that deep blue tone. You can add a variation or sporadically add your deep tones depending on what you want your picture to look like. So your blue and your purple will shine through. But in this effect, I'm trying to cover the area and have nice deep dark shades for the project. So let the paper dry before working on it again after you've applied your second layer. If you need a third layer, go ahead. If you need a fourth layer in certain areas, go ahead. Just remember the shades that you're mixing and what it is you're looking for. With gouache, you can go light. So you can have lighter shades on top of your darker shades, as opposed to watercolor. That is a bit difficult. You have to go from light to dark, and covering your dark areas normally don't work quite well with watercolor, but with gouache you can. So with the dry cakes though, you have to remember it still acts like a watercolor. So when you're applying your lighter color on top of your dark, you want to make sure that it is dry first. You can also activate the pigments below. So if you're going to add, say, a yellow on top of your deep royal blue, make sure that the paper is dry, because you will activate the blue that's underneath and it become a dark muddy color, and you don't want that. So make the paper dry thoroughly before adding any lighter shades on top or lighter color. And when you're adding the lighter color on top, don't do back and forth like hard motion. You want to be gentle with your strokes and not repetitively going over it. Okay, so just let the paper dry, and once it is dry, then you're good to work on the other layer. So just a quick reminder, you want to dilute the deep blue, rich blue, to a lavender light wash when we did our first application, and apply around the bubbles. So I didn't do that in the first half. I was more concentrating on the water body itself, but the bubbles that's near the mouth, you want to use the same blue that we have for the water and just water it down to a lavender, just a lighter blue shade, because you still want it to look like the water, but you just don't want it to be too thick so the bubbles, they are lost in the water. So we're trying to create texture that actually makes the water looks real, but at the same time the fish is trying to come up, so the water is not as dark and deep with that rich blue tone as you would normally have it. So just a slight wash there, it's slight blue, and just play around with a slight dragged motion to cover it. So I'm not trying to activate or reactivate the tone, the pigments with the pencil that we did our staining outline with first. I'm just trying to get the lavender light wash into the area where the bubbles is. And as I mentioned before, with the wash, it will leave a strong line. But the good thing about it is that you can activate the pigments. So I'm trying to blend out the harsh line. Another method is that you could slightly wet the area where the harsh line is, let it sit for a little bit, and then wet the area of the bubble that I want, the bubble area, and then pull that color in so it blends it out nicely into it, as opposed to leaving that strong harsh line. So point to note, when you're gouaching, if you don't want a strong harsh line, leave the area damp and wet, or do your blending all in one. So see how I do have that two-tone lavender wash. However, the darker area where the gouache outline is does look like a shaded area. So in this picture, it does not matter too much. All right. So here I'm going to do the lily pad leaves. So I'm applying the green wash mix onto the leaf. So I want to mix the dark blue leftover that I have with green to create a darker rich green, and then apply that to the leaf. I'm sporadically just applying it just to see what kind of texture and pattern I would like for my lily pad. So first, instead of just swiping it all over and covering the whole entire area, so working on it just to play around with the variation and see what I want my lily pad to look like. So I'm also mixing the brown. So I add the brown in a little bit more concentrated form. So just a slight wash, just slightly, just to get it moving instead of being thick and just slapping it on. So I added to the lily pad onto the wet lily pad. So the area is nice and wet and the blending is a lot nicer and smoother. So when you add wet on wet, this is the wet on wet technique. When you add wet paint that's moving to the area that is already wet, so paper wet, paper is wet, and that is what you call a wet on wet technique. So the blending is much richer and nicer and smoother. So I'm adding that to the lily pads just to make it look like it's rusty, it's worn, it's been there for months, it's dried up and it's burnt. The sun has done its work on it, so that's the effect I'm going for. So added the brown in a concentrated form to the wet leaf in order to get a nice richer blend. So I'm also adding straight from the tin to just a nice richer tone. If you realize that the green is starting to dry, and it does dry light, so remember your darker colors dry light, so you want to reapply, and I use a little bit from the pan just to get it nice and rich, and also I would dip it into the green that's already on my mixing tray just to get it moving and watered down. So you add the deep blue mix to the edge of the leaf wash when the paper is almost dry. So I'm going to go ahead and dip my brush into my already mixed blue and add it to the edges just to get it nice and shaded and not too light but not overly worked. So I'm doing that to both the lily pads, and as you can tell, the lily pad first one we did started to dry already, and it gives it that faded green look. So I might go over it just to see what it looks like. I don't want it too dark to be lost into the water, which is already a dark blue shade, but I want to go ahead and give it a dimensional look that makes it look as if it's an object all by itself, but it is actually doing something. It's not just one tone and hidden. So I'm adding a little bit of blue. You always want to have a little bit extra of whatever mixture you have, either for any part of the project, because you might need it to use blending into other colors or mix in. So don't feel bad if you have made enough. You want to make enough to actually have left over. So if you have to reapply, you already have that pre-mixed shade, so you don't have to worry about, oh, what did I use again? All right, so I'm going ahead and adding some of my browns to it as well, making it nice and textural. So you're learning texture at this point, variation and texture. So texture is different shades, different colors blended together to give it that effect as if something has happened to the object. So like with a rock, you would run your hands over it and you know there's grooves and areas that's not totally smooth, which we'll see in the rock section. So with a leaf, you know it's burned, probably a little bit worn, folded portions, curved, just when you would run your hands over a leaf. That is the texture that you want to give that illusion that something, this leaf has a story, something has happened to it. It's not just sprouted or it's been there for a while and you know it's been chewed on, laid on, tossed about, rolled over in the water. The sun has done its work. So that is the effect you're going for, and that is textures without actually touching it. So I'm also touching up my first leaf. As I mentioned, the same thing. Your colors dry light and you want to make sure that it has a nice rich tone. So I'm adding that blue because the first mix wash for the water of the blue will give it a nice dark tone, which is not black, but a nice dark shading tone. All right, so you want to give the illusion that the water, the lily pads are just beneath the fish. So the fish is slightly raising its head coming up with the bubbles, rather spittle, I think. I don't know what they do in the water, but it does look like bubbles. And the fish head is slightly rising up with a little pad just underneath it. So there's a slight bit of shading from the fish's body or head. So that's the illusion you want to give at this point. So you're learning textures, tone, and variation with shading. Alrighty, so reapply your gouache if you have to areas that need to be touched up, and then you'll have a different tone to your piece that is now actually telling a story. Alrighty. So continue to do that, and I will get to you in the next object. So for my rock, which we're at, I'm mixing a bit of the brown, the leftover blue that I had, which is the blue wash that we've made. Remember I mentioned making enough. I'm activating what is left on the palette just with a slight bit of water. I'm adding my brown because I'm going to paint my rock, but I'm doing it in a brownish tone. So you want to use the remainder of the blue, the brown, mix a little bit of white. So I'm trying to achieve a gray tone, an ash gray tone. I want to use this for both my rock, my bubble, and a slight mixture of this for the body of the fish. So you don't have to tip, a great big tip, you don't have to waste the colors that's already on your palette. This might seem weird, but I try not to waste my paint. So even though it might seem I have blue and green and red, but when I mix them all together to form a undertone, it works perfect. So never just wipe all your paint off and clean up. I mean, you're supposed to clean your palette up, but whatever paint is there can be activated, and you can make a mixture or a wash that actually works as a base layer for your project or your object. So don't forget that. Don't just leave the paint or wash it off all the time unless you really have to. Like it doesn't like if you have pink and you're going to go with a light shade of pink and they're just only dark colors in there, you definitely don't want to mix that. But if you're using dark tones, by all means go ahead and use up that paint. So what I've done, I've applied it to the rock, leaving areas that I want out to add some textures and tone. And here I'm adding it to the surface where my bubble outline is, and I'm blending it into, this is what I mentioned to you when you can paint over your darker areas, when you can get those lines out, harsh lines, by painting over. So I'm blending my ash gray into the blue in order to create a smoother transition, but I'm not just leaving it to that one particular area. I'm going over the front portion of the picture, just so it gives it a nicer blend and a nicer wash. So it's like a smoother transition, even though you made an error in the first half, or rather I did, by making that harsh line. So that's what I mentioned about thinking. So when I'm doing my outline and activating by staining and doing the watercolor pencil outline activation, it gives me time to think of my project and how I'm going to paint it. So even if I made a mistake, I'm able to work it and blend it in. So it's lovely when you can blend your gouache and it makes a smoother transition. So to make the page or the paper itself look uniformed and transitional, I go ahead and apply that same ash wash to the body of the water, just to give it some movement, a bit of glare, and a bit more uniformed transition going into the body of the fish and the other objects. So everything worked together as one coordinated piece, giving also the lily pads and the other object an idea that it is not just sitting there blah, but it is working. So the lily pads look like they're actually floating rather than stuck. If you want to think of it like that. Plus it gives it a bit of glare and tone down the deep richness of the water. So that is also lovely, and that's my ash. So mixing up all the darker shades and adding white. So white is a very lovely transitional mixing color. So with gouache, instead of using water all the time to blend it out, this is not a watercolor medium, it is gouache, so it's a bit thicker. So you don't want to blend it with water all the time so it's runny, unless you're trying to get a wash. But if you want to change the tone and the consistency of the paint or the color you have, mix the white to it. It tones the color way down, and it gives it still that nice rich texture to it, and it's not runny, but it is just change, like a variation of the actual color. So it softens it rather than water it down. Okay, so another tip when you're using gouache, white mixed in any shade that you have makes it a bit toned, softens it a bit instead of watering it down. Also, when I'm going on to my rocks, I'm going to mix orange, black, brown with a bit of white. I'm also using up the colors that are already on my palette too. So I want to mix those nice and make sure that they're nicely blended. Then I'm adding the brown texture to the rock in the left out space. To get that texture, I'm applying the brown, and then I use a bit of mix with the black and blue, whatever texture is there, and black and orange and brown, and just going over while the deeper brown is still wet, and just making it blend together because it's wet. So wet bleeding into the wet makes it a nicer, smoother texture. So I'm adding a bit of black because I'm trying to get a deep shade now. So I applied the orange, and now I'm applying, while it's wet, I'm applying the black to the rock to add a thicker layer of the black, and then pushing the black color around just to get variation. Remember, black dries a bit lighter, so don't worry, it will not be so pronounced. So I'm pushing it around just to get some textures going on into the rock. Some, as I mentioned, some story, right? So the rock is not just a baby rock, it's mature, it's been there for a while. So it has some textures to it. And then I'll let this dry before working on it again. So you want to go ahead and just play around with it. Remember, have fun while you're washing. It is not an intense piece. Art is made for relaxation, concentration. So you're working on a whole lot of things in your personal self. So you're doing personal growth here, which is patience. You're also relaxing, meditating, and thinking. And you're also being productive by doing something. Excuse me. So what I've done, I have added the white to the bubble. So after mixing it, I'm just dabbing it around. So I'm applying that in a thick layer, just the whitewash, thick, and dabbing to outline the water portion around the mouth in a circular movement, just like we've done when we're activating our watercolor pencil. So that's where the circular motion comes in. It plays a whole lot into whatever project we're doing. Just be careful not to overlap with the other objects. I'm adding some extra bubbles too as well because I think it looks a little bit better. So that's another fun, cool trick you can do too as well. And see how the white just blends nicely on top of the darker color instead of muddying it, because you allow the paint to dry so you can work on top of it. But remember, you can activate the colors below, so don't have a pool of water, pool of gouache sitting there. So I'm just mixing up some other colors as well. So what I'm doing is mixing my blue, just trying to get a nice blue tone to the bubble, just to make it a bit more pronounced, so you can actually tell that it is not just sitting there, but it actually is something. It's another object. It is it's a part of the picture, part of the story. So I'm just dipping it into the black to give it a nicer darker outline, but the black is also mixed with the blue and the white, so it's not going to look black. If you wanted, you could add whatever mixed over blue you had from your first wash and just slightly in a circular motion drag it around, just create an effect. So I want the bubbles to look like it's actually going up and spouting. So in areas it's a little bit thicker, a little bit intense, and then I add the blue, just dipping it because the paint is wet where the white is, So the blue is also wet, so it gives it a nice blend as well. All right, and I'm just moving it around, playing around with it, so it looks like it actually is coming from the fish, as opposed to just sitting there. I'm not sure what it's doing. So that's what I've done. So see how it looks a little bit smoky, but a little bit like it's coming from somewhere. So I've mixed a lot of black into my dark shade of brown, and I'm making the shades for the branch by just applying it sporadically to the area that we've already outlined and it's left there. So using my round brush, which is the consistent brush for this project, to apply it to the branch all over. And remember to leave in the tips out where it looks like the berries would be, but they're not really berries. I just say berries for now because it's round, circular kind of circle that was there. So that's going to actually be flowers on the end of the branches. So sometimes I'll use the black straight from the palette, or the brown, but at this point I'm just applying the brown all over. You can reapply the shade of brown if you want. So you see how I'm kind of activating the dry gouache that is actually on the palette. Even though it seems as if there's a lighter brown on the second level, the middle level, I dip it in and then I dip it in my brown, which is on top. Just try to activate it. So even if it looks dried up on the palette, don't worry, just a little bit of water. So instead of adding water, I just use the already mixed wet gouache and just activate it. There's nothing wrong with that. You won't change the color because the main color is more pronounced and it's just an undertone. So see how the brown is drying a bit lighter? You want to go ahead and reapply a second layer, a third layer, whatever makes the project a bit more darker if that's what you're looking for. So I'm adding some black to it now. So I mix the black straight from the palette and just add it to the texture of the branch because I'm trying to get to the body of the branch because I'm trying to get texture. So I'm sporadically just moving the black around just to create an effect like the branch has got some life to it. So I'm just moving it around, not in any particular, just playing around the edges, not trying to cover the entire branch with black because I want my brown to show through, but just to work it in so it looks like it's got some textures, as I mentioned, some story to it. So playing around with the texture and getting it some darker shades, some life, and you want to do that all over the branch. All right, so if you are satisfied with what the outcome is, then you can stop, but don't cover all the branch, the entire thing in black. You want to have the brown showing through, even though the darker shade, if you're going to make it dark, just go dark brown with the black, brown with the dark black, and make it dark. So moving on to my florets, my flowers. So I've added an intense red, concentrated red, mixing that with white to, well, at the moment I just mixed it with pure red and a bit of water, just dabbing it all over the open space that's there. So I'm making an illusion of a flower. So I'm actually not painting a flower itself, like painting the outline of a flower. I'm just creating the illusion of a flower. So I'll go ahead and I'll dab this all over the open space. I also find when I'm creating my art piece, and if there is not enough, just like with the bubbles, if there's not enough to make the picture pop or look real, like it's actually like you're trying to find a better story. You don't want to stick with exactly what you see if you're using a reference. So for me, most times I underdraw and then add if I want to, just like I'm adding extra florets to the branches, because I see that the picture will look a lot better if it's not so just blah. So adding a little bit more here and there, not overdoing it, just adding a little bit more to make an object a bit more alive or ties in a lot better with the story theme of the picture. You can go ahead and add. So that's what I'm doing here. The original artwork had a few florets, but I'm adding some more too because I see that the picture is a little bit awake. it's a little bit blah if there's just a few florets. I want the fish to look alive and happy in its environment. And I believe as an artist that adding more, in my eyes, create the story that I want, and you can do the same. So if you want to add more to the branch, just sporadically look at areas where your eye might think need to be covered. That makes a better story for you in your picture. So here I am not overdoing it, just dabbing as well. You want to do a dabbing motion. So you're adding and you're dabbing. The paint is wet, so be very conscious that the gouache is wet and red may dry a bit lighter. So be careful of that too. Keep that in mind while you're doing that. Just once you are satisfied, you can stop. If it's not thick enough in terms of deep or rich enough, you can add something to it. Like you can add a bit of black mixed in the red to give it a deeper shade, or a little bit of purple or blue, or something mixed together to give you a dark shade. But once you're satisfied, you can go ahead and stop. But if the paint is a bit too light, like the texture is not vibrant, sorry, the tone is not vibrant enough, you can go ahead and add another layer and then let it dry. And if you're not satisfied, you can add a third or fourth layer. But remember, depending on the effect that you want, if you want it to be nicely blended, don't let the paint completely dry, don't let the gouache completely dry before adding your third and fourth layer, because it has a nicer blend to it. So because my florets are a little bit blah, my paint is still wet, I just added straight from the cakes. You can mix it if you want, but I find that it's a little bit vibrant if you just take it straight from the cake. Remember, you're using white, and your brush, the tip of your brush, will get a bit muddied if you dip it in the red gouache. It will actually stain the brush, and you're going to dip it right back into the white. So you probably want to clean your brush off, but before you do that and add it into the white, you want to dry off the excess water. Very, very important. Reason being, you will have too much water on your brush tip, and that will cause a lot of bleeding and running into your paint. And you already have a foundational red that's set. You just want to add some textures and variation to your red dabs to make it look like flowers. All right, but however, if the gouache is a bit dry and not moving, you can slightly wet the tip of your brush, wipe off the excess water, and play around, like smooth out the white so it's not sitting there on top of the flowers, just like sitting there. I forgot that I'm a flower and I didn't blend it in, you know, that kind of a effect. So you want to blend it in. So another nice smooth dabbing motion. Go ahead and do that. If the white is just sitting on top, you dab it out so it actually blends nicely in. There you go. Unless that is the effect you want. If you want the white to just sit there, like sit in there, by all means go ahead, do not blend. But if that's what we're looking for, if we're trying to get the effect of a floret, we can go ahead. Certain areas you can actually do that just to make the floral a lot pronounced, but too much of it will make it look like you have no idea what a flower looks like and what you're doing. So remember, blending is key. Once you have the desired result that you are looking for, if you have any excess paint on the tip of your brush, just because you're looking for a transitional smooth flow, you're trying to create a story and you're trying to make the piece work together. So even though it's white with a little bit of red and you have a dark and a brown, black background, there's no harm in adding a little bit of texture to your branch. It just makes the flowers come alive and look as if they work together with the branch. If you look at a tree, or say a cherry blossom tree, it doesn't just, the brown sits there, the white sits there, it works together, ties in nicely. So just apply the remainder of the paint that's on the brush sporadically around, over, going into the joints, and just make the piece look a lot more better. So this is what I mentioned when you have your palette. You don't have to waste the paint, but by all means do clean your palette up. I like to work with a new, nice, fresh looking, just a nice clean tray. So whatever paint I don't want, I don't think I'm going to be using, I will either wash my tray off or clean it up. But for this part of the project, we're going to be doing the fish. I pulled whatever paint I wanted from the rest of the unused paint to make a wash, and I'm trying to create that grayish silver looking ash tone. So I clean up my palette using the round brush. I don't go out and just wash it off or find something, I just clean it up. And then I use the colors and I nicely blend them in, because I know I'm looking for a darker tone to create the fish, the body of the fish. So I have the option to do that. So just a few tips. You don't have to do that. I'm just trying to show you how you can use the paint up as opposed to just wasting the paint. I know it seems like a lot of paint, but you know what? You're going to be painting for a long time, and the more you have, the better it is. So I'm cleaning up my colors here. If I have a darker color on top, I clean it up by doing a first wash. And I'm also activating my colors. I'm activating the red, the orange, the yellow, and the black, as well as I'm cleaning up the brighter colors like the yellow and the orange. The red is quite fine. It doesn't need any cleaning up. Nice dark shade is pretty much good, but I'm activating them because I'm going to be using them straight from the cake itself. So I'm getting those prepared because I'm going to use them as textures for my my koi fish. Alrighty. So this is where all the magic comes into play. I'm pre-wetting the area of the fish. I'm going over the stained area where I've activated the watercolor pencil. I'm just waking up the body of the fish because I'm going to be working on it. So I'm pre-wetting the areas all over because we just did the watercolor pen, so there's not much lifting and running. There's nothing really like that. So I'm gonna now use my yellow and just dab. So I'm creating texture on a koi fish. So I'm sporadically, I've not outlined anything here. So the technique I'm using is wet on wet. Reason being, I want the paint to flow like water paint, so it does its own thing. There's no control here on my part. The only control is me dabbing it in areas, and I'm just dabbing it sporadically, reapplying and making it nice and bright as much as I can. And I'm doing the same thing because I want a nicer, smoother blending. Remember, blending. So the wet technique, wet on wet, while the area is wet, will give it a nicer mix of flow. So wet the area, and I want the colors to blend on the fish. I add them in concentrated form straight from the cakes. That's why we cleaned it up before, so I don't have any black shade running into it. And then I just apply it in a dabbing motion with my round brush, which is the brush for this project. So I sporadically add that all over, and once I'm done, I'm gonna let it dry. See how I added the orange and it just ran right into the yellow and the and just the red. So I added the red, sorry, and it just runs right into the orange and the yellow, and that is what we're looking for. See how it spreads because the water is already there, and that's the motion that you're looking for, because the koi fish has beautiful texture. So if the area is dry, just dip the tip of the brush into the water and then add it straight from the cake. It will give you that spreading motion just the same. All right, so once that is dry, I definitely let this part dry, because if you don't, you will have a lot of bleeding and you're not looking for an abstract kind of a look. Right now you're looking for the abstract texture, but the whole picture is not abstract. All right, so abstract is a lot of bleeding, running, blending, but this is more nice and concentrated. It's just a bit of variation of blending for the body of the koi, because that's how koi look. They have these lovely rich blending. I'm always amazed when I look at a koi fish. So with dabbing motion, just helping the blending to apply. If you want a bit more yellow, just be careful to add the yellow in areas where you won't have a lot of running of the red and the orange. All right, so let's recap. I've added my fish. It's all done. We've learned a lot of techniques here. The only thing that I didn't get to show you is the body of the fish when we applied the ash green to it, sorry, the ashes gray to it, and then we go ahead and we outline with a dab of black and so forth. So you've learned a lot today in this basic picture: blending, contrasting for deeper shade, mixing the gouache, and making the picture tell that story. Right, so now that you're done, go ahead and showcase your masterpiece, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial.